In a recent vlog, I talked about acrylic paints and what really matters with acrylic paints. You remember it was a very long ramble, if you saw it, but it brought up the question: well, what about all of those additives for paints, various thinners and mediums and things like that? What are those for? How do I know which one to pick? Which ones are useful? And I'm expanding on the question, but which ones are useful, which ones are not, what do you use in what situation? So I thought I'd address that in this video. Now, I think the key to getting thinners and mediums and basically additives to paint is to look a little more at what makes up a bottle of paint, whether it's from, this is from Vallejo, this is a dark Prussian blue, but whether it's from Vallejo, AK 3rd Gen, Citadel, any other brand, doesn't matter. We're just talking any water-based acrylic paint. Now, the basic three ingredients are: you're going to have a pigment, and it's just you know what pigments are, just ground up pigment, and those pigments aren't, they don't have people that take chalk and sit there all day and shave chalk down. I've seen pictures. It's pretty interesting, or at least it was to me. I've seen pictures of, I think it was the Vallejo factory, and the pigments that they get in, and it's bags and boxes. I mean, just tons of this pigment from all over. Some of them are natural, some of them are synthetic, as I understand it. They're all sorts of different colors, and they, in what's called a single pigment paint that I spoke of in that last video, they'll put just a particular pigment in a particular paint, and you've got pure color with that, whereas others may be mixes of pigments to get a specific color. But it's pigment, very finely ground up. Now, there are two other key ingredients in this bottle of paint, or any bottle of paint. There is an acrylic resin binder in it, and then there is some form of thinner, generally, in the case of these, water-based. Now, the acrylic resin binder, what it does is make the pigment work in water. If you've ever taken pigments, say weathering pigments, and put them in your palette and just put some water in it, you know that they'll float on the top. You might be able to dissolve them a little in it, but then they separate pretty quick, float to the bottom. It's great for weathering, but in terms of painting, it's just completely useless. One time I was showing this to someone, and I put some pigment in, stirred it up with water, and tried to paint it on, and it just went in a horrible patchy mess. The acrylic resin, the acrylic binder that goes in it, what it does is it literally gives a binder to pull the pigments together. The pigments can dissolve in it, and this is not a technical term, but for the sake of discussion, it works. It forms kind of a solid blob of color. Once you mix the pigment and the acrylic resin, the pigment becomes suspended in the resin, and then that can be useful. That can be spread around and evenly spread the pigment around. That can be controlled. The pigment doesn't come apart in that acrylic resin binder, but rather it disperses evenly through it, and so it's going to be much easier to work with in terms of a paint. But of course, now you've got something that's, again, this is oversimplification, but if you think of it as, now you've got a thick blob of something. I mean, think of if you've ever, future floor polish. You put a blob of it. Now it's kind of thin, but you put a blob of it somewhere, it dries, and it just leaves a little blob on your workbench or something. It's not in that form not necessarily usable. That's where the water comes in. The water comes in to thin that binder down so that we can then put the bottle, or put the paint in the bottle, shake it up, which mixes it all together, put it on the palette, and it flows off the brush evenly. So there's going to be some other chemicals in there, but at the base you have pigments, binder, and water. Now, to further take it from there, once you get a bottle of paint, and again, any bottle of, we're talking any bottle of water-based acrylic paint, even the ones that are gel medium, I mean, they still have to work the same way. In addition to the water, there are going to be other chemicals put in there that help the paint. There may be various types of things put in there to make it flow a little better. There may be various types of things in there to make it thinner, but not just water, which we're going to talk about. That's where you start getting into the other mediums and things like that. There are things that are put in there to keep it from going bad, to discourage bacterial growth and things like that. So there are other additives that are put in at the factory, and you need to kind of keep that in mind when you're going to be working to thin your paints for various purposes, that there may already be some things present in there that are of the type you're already planning to add. Now, as an example of that, let's compare these two. Now, I'm kind of going by Vallejo's marketing materials, their press materials, so I'm assuming they're going to tell the truth. We'll actually talk about that in a minute. But you've got your model color paint here and a game color paint. They both have pigments. They both have an acrylic resin binder in them. They both have water in them. This one is supposed to, according to Vallejo, have additional additives in it to make the paint more durable, so that when it goes onto a mini, it doesn't rub off as easy when you're handling it. Also, this apparently has some flattening agents in it, because this type of paint, this new reformulated game color paint, is fairly matte compared to your normal model color paint. So even though these are both water-based acrylics, they represent things that are put into paint. They have things in them that are put into paint that alter the properties a little bit. And we can do the same thing. We can add things to our paints to alter their properties a little bit. Now, to try and further explain thinning and what you have to consider when you're thinning any paints, when you're adding any additives to any acrylic paint. I'm going to use this piece of paper towel. We'll just imagine that at a molecular level, at a very magnified level, this is some paint, and we'll just call it white paint. But it's the pigments, it's the binder, it's the water, and it's, imagine that it's not in a dried state, but this is the liquid state, but we're kind of looking at the bond between all of those materials. So you've got, it's a fairly solid thing. It's got some opacity that you can't see through it. It's got some strength. I mean, obviously I can tear this, but I mean, for the sake of illustration, if I pull on this, there's not really much flex in it, and it's got its own characteristics. Now, if I come in and add water to it, well, it's going to change the characteristics, because now you see that I can see through it. Because in paint, what's happening is you're taking the same amount of acrylic resin binder and pigment suspension. Remember the blob we talked about? You're taking that same blob that's already in some sort of thinner, but you're spreading it out so that it has to spread itself through even more thinner. So you can see here that this paper towel now has, in essence, become thinner. It's less opaque. Now, I know the paper towel hasn't actually spread out, but it illustrates the point that now it's beginning to spread out. And you can see, we'll just pretend all the little patterns that you can see in there in the paper towel are the little molecules and things like that. Things are starting to separate. And it means that that acrylic resin binder is not as strong. So there's a certain point that it can be pulled and it's got less strength, but it can be pulled apart like glazing or something like that, but it still has full coverage. It's still generally opaque, maybe not quite as see-through, but it still has some coverage capability. But if I continue to add water to it, like this, at some point, there's going to be so much water in there that the acrylic binder and the pigments, the stuff that makes up the paint, just can't work with that much water in it. And you see the paper towel is starting to tear. So that's kind of a very cheap visual demonstration of what's happening in paint, is that at some point those acrylic binders become so weakened by the water, the excess water that's been put in there, that it breaks apart. That's where you start getting paint that might be grainy, that might not cover well. If you've ever really thinned certain types of paints down for glazing and you glaze it on, you start seeing you have little islands of color all around. It's not one solid glaze, but rather it's little islands of color, and it's broken apart. And it just doesn't look good. That's because that acrylic binder has started to break down, and it can't maintain its shape, its structure, because of all of the water that's been put in it, all of the thinner that's been put in it. Now, with all that in mind, let's start talking about the various mediums and thinners that you can put in your paint. Now, when you're adding anything to your paint, you have to consider what's the effect that it's going to have on the paint. Is it going to thin it down? Is it going to thicken it up? Is what I'm putting in, what effect is it going to have on that acrylic binder? What effect is it going to have on how the paint flows? What effect is it going to have on the paint's drying time? All of those things are considerations. Just acrylic paint right out of the bottle, you paint on a thin coat, it may be dry before you paint from, the part you just painted may dry within 30 seconds to a minute. So acrylic paints can dry really quick if they're thinned out properly and put on in a thin coat. So they can dry really quick. There are ways you can extend the drying time. There's ways that we're able to airbrush it. All of these things contribute to it, so you have to know the properties of what it is that you're putting in and how much you can get away with and when you might start running into problems. Now, to talk about specific items, here I have satin varnish, which of course imparts a satin coat on things. What I'm going to talk about with a satin varnish is generally going to be true for a matte varnish or a gloss varnish. These can be added to paint to change the finish. Obviously, if you add this, it's going to make the paint a satin finish. If I added the satin finish to this very matte paint, theoretically, I should come out with something that is more satin than matte. But when you're adding something like a varnish, you have to factor in the fact that it's going to thin out the paint somewhat. And what effect is that going to have? Now, a lot of this, and I say this a lot, and I've, every now and then I get messages from people kind of calling me to task saying, but I don't have time to build a lot of models and get this experience. But this is one of those things that the understanding of how much varnish, for example, you can put in paint is going to come through experience. That's why it's always good to have just a little cheap model standing by that you can do some testing on. But you have to factor in, okay, is this going to thin it? How much is it going to thin it? Is it going to thicken it up? This satin varnish is actually kind of thick. It can thicken the paint up. So if you put something in that thickens the paint up, then you have to consider, okay, what do I have to do now to thin the paint out to get that to work? Now, my opinion is you're better off putting the paint on without the satin varnish, the matte varnish, the gloss varnish, whatever. And then when it's done, putting the varnish over it. Because the varnish, what it really does is it determines the degree to which light is scattered. So when you put a matte finish on something, it's best, especially for a matte finish, I think, to put it on afterwards, because it has properties in it that are going to make the surface at a microscopic level very rough, and they're going to scatter the light, and thus it's going to appear matte. When you put it in the paint, it's going to reduce its ability to make something matte. Same way if you put in gloss, it's going to reduce its ability to make something gloss, because in the example of that very matte paint, if you put in some gloss medium with a very matte paint, you're probably going to get something kind of satin. But that's how satin varnishes work. Like I said, you can, or varnishes work. You can add them to paint, but you have to consider what's it going to do to change the property. And you've got to do that with all of these. Now, let's say you're just wanting the paint to be thinned for brush painting. You're not looking for anything special. You're not looking for any special characteristic. You just want it to be thinner for brush painting. For the most part, water is perfect for that, because water, while it will thin out that acrylic binder and cause it to spread out more because there's more thinner, there's a certain point that it's strong enough that you can add water to it and it works. Most paints that I use from Vallejo and Citadel work fine with maybe 2 parts water, 1 part paint. Some of the Citadel paints, I think they're a little more durable. I've taken it down further, 4 parts water, 1 part paint, and still been able to get good glazes. But there's a point where you start getting to where it seems like there's just little chunks of things in your glaze. So that's where, when you're just trying to do basic thinning, that's where you've gone too far. But again, I'm really talking about paint thinning. Now, you can use other mediums to thin the paint out so that you don't have to worry about it breaking apart and it maintaining the characteristics of the paint. When I add water to a paint, it is going to make that resin thinner and thus weaker. So say on a Mini, if you don't put some kind of varnish over it, it's going to affect its durability. So that's where something like acrylic mediums, like this big bottle I have here from Liquitex, or Lamian medium from Citadel, these are essentially the same product. This one is just in a thinner bottle, costs a lot more per ounce, and has been pre-thinned. This is very liquid. This is fairly thick. It's almost, I don't know if you can see it in the bottle there. I don't know if there's enough light for it to pick up, but it's very more glue-like in terms of its thickness. Now, you can add some water to this and thin it down. But as you're adding water, say, to this and then into your paint, you have to experiment and figure out how much of this can you get away with in putting it in, because while this is going to essentially mimic the acrylic binder so that it keeps the strengths of the binder there. It just essentially provides more binder for the pigment to spread out through. That's what makes it work. But at the same time, like this stuff, because it's thicker, you've still got to add something into, and water's fine to take that into account. But you can extend the paint with mediums. Now, I like, on a day-to-day basis, I like this Lamy medium because it works really well, and I recommend it. If you don't do a lot of painting, I recommend this because it's pre-mixed, it's pre-thinned, it's ready to go, it's got everything in it you need. And, you can, if you're wanting to do something, you can work with this just fine. Now, if you get this, you'll add it with some water. Sometimes I just pre-mix it and put it into a dropper bottle like this and use it that way. So you can have some standing by. Now, just a brief mention, this is Citadel's contrast medium. It is a medium for their technical paints. Their technical paints are slightly different in terms of their characteristics. But if you're going to be working with contrast paints and you want to thin them, I recommend you use the contrast medium because it works best. You can use Lamy medium. You can use water. There's a point with water where you start getting into some weird behaviors from the contrast paints. So I put this here just to remind me to say, if you're going to be using contrast paints, consider getting some of this. Now, earlier I'd mentioned that acrylic paints dry really fast. One of the mediums that you can put in is a retarder medium. It slows the drying down. Now, we're not talking about slowing it down to oil paint level. It means that you have a few more minutes practically before it starts drying out. And really, in my mind, in my experience, the benefit of using this is not that it slows the drying on the model so much as it slows the drying in the palette and slows the drying on the brush. That's where I think there's some benefit to it. Now, if you're doing wet blending, this can be beneficial because you can put some on the model. You can put down your first color. It remains wet longer. You can put down your second color. You can then use your brush to blend the two in there. Again, that's something you've got to experiment with to figure out how much of this. I will say, if you use retarder medium to slow the drying down, use very, very, very little of this stuff. This stuff will change the characteristics of the paint in an odd way if you put in too much of it. It can start breaking things down. It works well to slow the drying, but it brings about its own baggage. So keep that in mind when you're using it. But it can be useful, like I said, in those wet blending techniques. Or you may have seen, like Martin Kovac on Night Shift Scale Models, when he's doing chipping with a brush and acrylic paints, he'll put some retarder medium in the paint just to keep it viable in the palette longer, so that it's not drying up in the palette and he can use it longer that way. Now, there are thinners that you can get for the paint. Like this is Airbrush thinner, and this is from Vallejo, and of course it's designed to be, for you to put it through the airbrush, but you can use this to thin your paints for brush painting also. Now, most things that just say acrylic thinners, you have to, if you can get a hold of the material safety data sheet, you have to kind of play it by ear with these, and I'll tell you why. This airbrush thinner from Vallejo contains water, and it's Spanish water, and if you know Lincoln Wright, you know that joke. It's Spanish water, and there is a chemical in there called butyl cellulose. Now, I think that's the industry name. I don't know that that's the chemical name. It is a glycol ether. If I remember Andy Butcher telling me what it was, it's an ether. It's a type of alcohol, but it's not alcohol, like rubbing alcohol. You know, when I see people saying, "Oh, I thin my acrylic paints with rubbing alcohol," that's not the alcohol that works best. Glycol ethers work best. Now, this, my understanding is this has between 6 and 12% butyl cellulose in it. Now, butyl cellulose is a chemical. It's not one you want to drink, certainly, but it's actually used to clean stains. It can be used, it's the basis for a lot of cleaners, and it's the basis for a lot of cleaners that are considered food safe, meaning you can clean something with it, then rinse it with water, and it's safe for use in restaurants. So it's actually a cleaner. But what it does is it helps the paint flow better. It helps. You know how if you take put a drop of water on a surface, it will just kind of, there's a point where it can just sit there and it's kind of mounded up. But if you take just a little bit of soap on an end of a toothpick and put it in that drop of water, suddenly the drop of water flows like that. It makes the paint, it makes the liquid slicker, if that makes any sense. It makes it flow better. Now, what I found out when I started doing some research on airbrush thinner and airbrush flow improver is the best I can tell is the only real difference between this and this is the concentration of butyl cellulose in it. This apparently has more butyl cellulose in it, more towards the 12% than this does. And that's based on Vallejo's own material safety data sheet. Because in the material safety data sheet, they tell you that they both read exactly the same, that it contains between something like 6 and 12% butyl cellulose. And it doesn't list any other ingredients other than water. So in my own experience, I've found that I like the airbrush flow improver a little better if I'm going to be applying, if I'm going to be using Vallejo products. It works fairly well, but with what I know now, I would not buy both of these. I would just get this one because it has a high, my estimation is this has a higher concentration of the thing that makes it work. So if you don't want it to be as concentrated, if you want it to be more like airbrush thinner, you just add a little bit more water, a little less of this, a little more water, and you're arriving at that. Now, having said all of that, let me set those aside for a minute. I have, and I would do air quotes here if I did air quotes, I have discovered this Airbrush Thinners 2.0 from VMS. This stuff is so good, it runs circles around the Vallejo stuff. I've used this Vallejo stuff in Citadel paints and Vallejo paints, things like that to try and airbrush them. And they worked okay, but it was a struggle. This stuff makes all of them work better than anything I've ever used. So if you're thinking of airbrushing acrylics, I would highly recommend going to VMS's website, getting some of this. They sell it in a smaller bottle. I just got it in this, and I use one of those little eyedropper kind of things to just pull out what I need and put it in with my paints when I do the airbrush thinner. What's in this? Well, let's see. I haven't read. I don't know that it tells the chemicals that are in it. No, I don't see anything that tells what's in it, but I'm guessing it's some sort of glycol ether because that's what makes acrylic paints flow better and things like that. So keep that in mind. This is one I highly recommend. Now, there's this Liquitex Flow Aid. It works really good with brush painting, and it's the liquid itself it's fairly runny, but it's a little bit viscous. This is more water-like. This has got a little bit of viscosity to it, a little bit of slickness to it. It's good for brush painting. If you're going to be doing brush painting, I would recommend this over this. This is better for airbrushing. This is going to help the paint flow better, but you have to be careful because it's still thinning those acrylic binders out. Now, if you're wanting the acrylic binders to be reinforced, that's where you go with these acrylic mediums like this, or that's where you can go with a glaze medium. Now, a glaze medium is really just, I don't know chemically what the difference is because I've not been able to find anything definitive, but in practice, a glaze medium doesn't seem to be much different than a matte medium, other than it doesn't seem to impart a particular finish. Now, I'm sure it's got a finish, but if I had to call it, I would say it's more of a satin finish. Now, what the glaze medium does, and this is why I think it's a combination of chemicals. I think a glaze medium, the way it behaves more like a matte medium mixed with a retarder medium. This one is very useful if you're painting and you're wanting to glaze and you're wanting to thin the paint way down, but you're not wanting it to break apart. Now, you want to use this in very little amounts. It's actually very, very thick. I don't know if you can see, but it's just beginning to flow down to the top of the bottle. It's not, if you really shake it up, it's a fairly thick stuff. So you've got to keep that in mind. You don't use this to create a glaze. It's not like you put 10 parts of this and 1 part paint. You'll get a mess. You put 1 part paint, 1 part this, and then 2 or 3 parts water, and you're going to get a better glaze than if you just tried to use 10 parts water. Again, this is going to help that binder stay together better. It's going to help the binder spread out evenly. It's going to help the binder stay together, and thus the pigments remain suspended in the binder in one mass rather than being broken up into clumps. So this glaze medium is going to have the benefit of what you get from just normal thinning mediums and a little bit of the benefit of the retarder medium. So if you're wanting to pick between one of these two, I think having this is going to be a much better choice when it comes to thinning your paints. Now, just as a side note, because it's a different type of paint, but if you like using Tamiya paints and you have some of those, you can brush paint those on, but you have to treat them more like, hey, where'd that little guy come from? You have to treat them more like lacquers. Tamiya does make a paint retarder that you can put into their paints that make it better for brushing, not perfect. If you've ever seen the video I did a long time ago about brush painting with Tamiya paints, you saw it. They work better with more of a stippling thing, but there is a paint retarder available for Tamiya. Now, I know this has been kind of all over the place, and I apologize for that, but there are so many different mediums and so many different scenarios that you can use them in. I think the key is to always think in terms of that binder pigment blob. What's it going to do to that? Because when you start thinking about how that's spreading out in the thinner, what's happening to that part, because that's the part that's important. That's the part that has the color. What's going to happen to that? That's when using these, figuring out these makes more sense. Now, if I had to, recommend, okay, what one product would you get for various scenarios? If you're not painting a lot, if you're not doing, these little tiny bugs keep showing up. If you're not doing a lot of painting, Citadel's Lamian medium is fantastic for most day-to-day use. I always keep a bottle of this, even though I've got this This is so convenient and pre-mixed. If what I found is there was one of the channels that's fairly famous. He never buys this. He gets this, and he puts it into kind of a bottle like this, and he mixes it, I don't remember, 50-50 with water. I don't remember the exact ratio. And so for a while I tried that. But what I found, and I don't know if it's because we're on well water or what, maybe I should have used distilled water, but this stuff would just start stinking after a while. It would still work fine, but it just smelled awful. So I went away from mixing large batches of it to just using this when I need it. But quite often I just go right to this because this has something in it that keeps it from having any problems. But yeah, for just day-to-day use, occasional use, I think the Lamy and medium is perfect. I like it better than most of the Vallejo, the kind of the Vallejo equivalent. But I do like having this glaze medium. So get this first, get this second. This kind of slows down the drying time. I like this. I found the retarder medium. I don't actually use it very often because it's so strong that I just find I have better control with the glaze medium. So I use my glaze medium less for glazing and more as a retarder. When I tend to glaze, I tend to go with water. So Lamy and medium, glaze medium, and water for your brush painting tend to be the products that I would go, I have to have those. The airbrush thinner, the airbrush flow improver, even the Liquitex Flow Aid. There's some creators on YouTube and things like that that just swear by this stuff. It works well, but I've found that between these two, whatever's in this, I get. So, and I'm only using it a drop at a time. So instead of trying to come up with complicated mixes, I just, okay, a little bit of glaze medium, some Lamy and medium, I'm right where I want to be. If you're doing a lot of stuff though, having the matte medium and the Flow Aid are not bad things to have around. Varnishes, in my opinion, are best used, like I talked about earlier, over this top surface. So satin, gloss, matte, ultra matte, whatever, having those, you get as you need them and you put them over the surface. I rarely, if ever, mix them with the paints anymore because it's just so much easier to put them over the surface of the model and not have to worry about how it's altering the paint. So these are use as needed. Experiment with it, but you may find that you feel like I do, that it's best put over the paint. Now, when it comes to airbrushing, this VMS stuff, I mean, I don't airbrush with anything else anymore. Yeah, it says with homogenizing and leveling agents. I don't even know what those are, but it works better than anything I've ever used. I've used every suggestion that anybody's ever provided about how to get water-based acrylics to airbrush nicely, and I was never satisfied with any of them. That's why for years, even if I was painting most of the model by brush, if I did airbrush work, I just used Tamiya paints because Tamiya's airbrushed so easily and so nicely. This stuff has made me start airbrushing with acrylics a lot more. And I actually find that while it's still not easy to clean the airbrush, this seems to make it easier than the other stuff I've used. This stuff, really, when it comes down to it, in my opinion, it's not much different than water when it comes to airbrushing. This, even though I wouldn't recommend getting this, it's not bad. I just wouldn't recommend getting it. This is just, I find it more useful with thinning for brush painting than I do anything. Now, one thing I meant to talk about when I was talking about thinners, there is a Testors brand, I think it's called Universal acrylic thinner or something like that. I don't recommend getting Tester thinners for your acrylic paints. The reason being is there's two particular types that I've run into. One seems to be pretty much this, has the butyl cellulose in it. The other one that is listed as the universal carrier, when I got a hold of the material safety data sheet. Turns out it's just water. Now it may be, you know, water that's been filtered and doesn't have any chemicals in it, doesn't have any minerals in it or something like that. Maybe purified water, which is nice, but you can get that at the grocery store. There's no point in buying a bottle of water from Testers for, you know, $7 or $8, just because they call it the universal thinner. So that's one I would be wary of. Well, I just realized I went through that whole segment to recommend what it was I would, if you know, you boiled it down, what would I recommend? And I got through it and I realized I talked about everything, and I don't know that it was clear what I recommended. This for general thinning, this if you need to extend the drying time, and then any varnishes you need based on your needs: matte, satin, gloss. If you're airbrushing, this stuff. This is, for the most part, unless in just some video I just want to talk about, you know, maybe how to use this or something like that. This is what I use. Previously, when I was thinking a little different for how I do YouTube videos, I thought it was important to try these products on camera and to explain them and to show them and all of that, because I was thinking in terms of being competitive, growing the channel, being helpful, all of those things. Now, I like being helpful, but when it comes to my practical use now, this is what I go with. And most of the time, I'm really just going with water. After a while, you learn how much you can get away with water. So this is a handy one to have. If I had to narrow it down to two, get these two. This one if you do airbrushing, this one for brush painting. And then, of course, water, which is 3, so it's not 2. But again, it all comes down to what is it going to do to affect that blob, that acrylic resin material that the pigment is suspended in. What's it going to do to affect that? That's what you need to be looking at. That's what matters. All right, well, thank you so much for being a patron. I hope this has been helpful and kind of maybe demystifying some of the mediums and thinners and things like that, and how you use them. There's a lot of overlap between products, and that's why I think that with these minimums and maybe some of these added in, you've got all the best characteristics available to you that you could buy a whole bunch of more products. But if you viewed it as little circle charts, all of these would overlap and just pretty much cover every need you're going to have. So I hope this has been helpful, and I certainly thank you for being a patron. And I know stuff like this can be boring, but knowing this stuff and being comfortable with its use is going to, in my opinion, I know in my own work, contribute to having fun. The better you can get your paint to behave and work for you, the more fun you can have when you're putting it on. So it all comes down to having fun with it. Happy day to you, friends. Bye-bye.